Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility on what has turned out to be a beautiful Tuesday. It is the 18th day of March, and we welcome you to today's program. If you are with us live on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon, cold and cloudy all morning, but the sun seems to have broken through now, and I understand we're looking at one more weather system this week, and before we get into some pretty good weather towards the end of the week, but be that as it may, we're not going to complain about it. I still think this is one of the most beautiful places to live that on God's earth. But anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you today. I need to apologize for not being with you yesterday. I was having a few health issues, and I understand basically we had a power issue here at Head On Radio Network anyway, which would have made it impossible for us to go on. Apparently, one of the issues that sometimes happen in the world of technology, which I don't totally understand, but I can appreciate, a power surge apparently blew out the telephone interface for the program, and yesterday we had no power at all. Today we have power, but we cannot receive phone calls, unfortunately. So Bob's looking at his program this evening as being somewhat similar to this one, in the sense that what is a very healthy monologue on his program is going to become pretty much of a one-way operation, kind of like this, like we've been having here at the Virtual Center. So, we're having some technical problems, but we appreciate you being with us. In my case, it's a pleasure to be back with you. It seems like it's been an awful long time since we got together. I've been reading emails from several of you, and I appreciate those. And I got a couple from Jim, who called us on our last time together here at the Virtual Center, and he sent me a couple of emails in the interim since then, and I appreciated Jim very, very much. Again, I won't bother giving you the phone number since you're not going to be able to use it anyway. But if you would like to react to some of the issues that we're dealing with here at the Virtual Center, then by all means, I would love to hear from you personally on my website, on my email, in my email, and my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, waobrien906@gmail.com. Because of the program and missing the program yesterday, I thought that it would probably be a good idea to kind of revisit where we left off in our last program together, which was, it seems like, some time ago. But we were mainly talking, as you'll recall, about American foreign policy, and more specifically, we looked at Wilson's 14-point program at the end of World War I and talked about it as a scheme for preserving the peace of the world. And I wanted to spend a few moments going back and reviewing some of that in order to bring us up to date. And then I wanted to bring it to a conclusion, which I had hoped to do yesterday and was unable to do so. Again, I would love to hear from you here at the Virtual Center. So, if you drop me an email, I will definitely make it a point to respond to you. We'll find out ways to work out these technical programs and these technical glitches, and we'll get back, because what we're doing is too important to just let it lay, as it were. So I trust that you'll hang in there with us, and you'll let us know what we can do to make your time and your appreciation for not only the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, but the Head-On Radio Network as well, work even better for you than it has been working in the past. I think, as I've said many times, I can't overemphasize the fact that in this day and age, it appears more important than ever that the voice represented on this network remain out there and remain viable and remain competitive and is heard by as many people as possible. Because what we're seeing and hearing more and more about is the extent to which there's only one option available. I'm thinking right now of the plebiscite that was held in Crimea this past Sunday, which received a 96.5% voter turnout, when in fact there was really only one choice. As somebody said in an email, I think it may have been Tom Friedman in the New York Times, there were two choices on the ballot. One is to support Crimean independence from the Ukraine, and participate and move forward in efforts to reunite with Russia. And then the second choice was the choice for those who really wanted to separate from Crimea from the Ukraine and find a way to reunite with Russia. And of course, many of you probably have already noted in the press today, in the media today, that Vladimir Putin has welcomed Crimea back into the Russian family, as it were. Also, of course, he has discouraged or dismissed any talk of adding any additional parts of the Ukraine to the orbit, to the Russian orbit. But I think, as many of you recall, and I think when Jim called last week, he made the same point, that if you recall, Adolf Hitler made pretty much the same statement when German forces moved into the Sudetenland and divided Czechoslovakia in the late 1930s. He also suggested that he only wanted the Sudetenland because it was populated predominantly by Germans. As it turned out, once the German forces were there, they took the entire nation of Czechoslovakia, and as a result of that, as you know, we moved rapidly from there into World War II. So I really think that this is very, very important. But I also think that there are very, very serious issues out there that need more than one voice coming from more than one direction. And so it's very, very important to do everything that we can do to keep this voice on the air. Let me go back and, if I can, and just review rather quickly. I'll try to do it rather quickly. Some of the issues that we had talked about last week related to American foreign policy. And again, I'll go back very briefly to the very beginning of the issue, which I think is significant. And of course, it really begins in the late 19th century with the tremendous production potential of the Industrial Revolution. There is absolutely no question that the Industrial Revolution links the success of domestic quality of life domestically and the success of a nation's foreign policy internationally in intricate ways that have always existed but never were as important as they become after the late 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution. Very briefly, the Industrial Revolution makes the acquisition of new sources of raw material and new markets more important than ever before, because not to be successful in finding them will result in an economic slowdown, layoffs, job loss, depression, and ultimately the kind of economic downturn which seems to be the key ingredient in overthrowing governments. In other words, the very stability of the nation and the way of life and the quality of life for its people depends more than ever before on the success of the foreign policy apparatus of that nation. And so to assume at all that there is any real distinction between domestic policy and foreign policy is really a mistake, especially when you're talking about this particular period. Then comes the question, as you'll recall, we touched on the content of the so-called open door notes and the evolution of the policy, the American foreign policy, which, for lack of a better term, we've referred to as the idea of the open door or the open door policy. It occurred in the late 19th century, principally because the major industrial nations of the world at that time were carving spheres of influence for themselves within China. And the United States was not a party to that process. We were not there. And everybody recognized that the potential of world productivity and world economic growth was increasingly tied to a nation's ability to access the China market because of the potential consumer market available there. And so the result of that is that the United States of America, under Secretary of State John Hay, develops a policy of economic expansion, which had always been there, going all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine in the early 19th century. The idea of opening up the spheres of influence of our competitors to the point that there are certain basic agreements made that trade commerce within existing spheres of influence would be permitted. In other words, each nation, industrial nation, would open up its sphere of influence to the principle of free trade, to the principle that anybody could come in and buy and sell anywhere within anyone's sphere of influence. And the other major piece of the open door notes was the preservation of the territorial integrity of China, because the policy was very, very cognizant of the fact that the successful pursuit of the China market by industrial competitors could be successful only as long as China remained whole, only as long as China remained a viable entity, a viable country. Because the Chinese government, more than anything else, would preserve domestic peace and stability within China, which is absolutely essential for commerce to operate. Trade and business and all that's associated with it, finance and everything else, all depend on stability and security. And so an unstable social situation or political situation in China would disrupt the economic environment to such an extent that all the major nations seeking access to the China market would be harmed by it. So in order to preserve that kind of internal peace and stability and security in China, the open door notes emphasized the significance of maintaining the existence of China as an entity as being critically important. And the argument was that each nation was asked to endorse these principles. The principle of free trade within their spheres of influence, coupled, of course, by the right for each nation to trade in other nations' spheres of influence, and the willingness to make sure that the Chinese government remained stable, remained in place. And so the Chinese government was paid a regular revenue in the form of tariffs, commercial tariffs, as a way to maintain the economic viability and stability of the Chinese government. And, of course, all of this works directly against the public interest of the people of China. Obviously, it becomes very clear to the most to the most intelligent within China that the wealth of China is being exploited and is flowing back to these respective countries, Japan being one of them, England, France, Germany, Italy, and Russia. And the only major nation it's not there, of course, is the United States. And the open door policy is designed to correct that by giving the United States access to free trade within everybody else's sphere of influence. And John Hay sends the notes out, and reluctantly the nations agree, and this becomes the operative policy of economic competition among competitors within the China market. But it does not take long. This is in 1899. In early 1900, rebellion breaks out against the Chinese government, against the Manchu dynasty, in what is called the Boxer Rebellion. And obviously, the whole purpose of the Boxer Rebellion is to throw all the foreigners out of China. It's to basically close off China for the Chinese. And the basic premise there is all the wealth that is flowing out of China through the commerce of these nations will be retained within China for the benefit of the people of China themselves. Obviously, the success of the Boxer Rebellion would be at the expense of every one of the major industrial powers. But given the pressures, the economic and social as well as political pressures of the Industrial Revolution, no nation in the world can afford to let this happen. So consequently, the nations join together. They pool their resources in order to create an international army for the express purpose of crushing the Boxers. And they are able successfully to do that in 1900. At which point, John Hay sends out a second round of open-door notes, asking the major powers to reconfirm their commitments to both the open door concept, the idea of the open door, and to the territorial integrity of China, recognizing that in retaliation against the Boxers, European countries are liable to turn or convert their spheres of influence into colonies. And if these nations colonized the portions of China that they control commercially, then the United States would be out in the cold. So the reaffirmation and recommitment of these nations to the principles of the open door and to the territorial integrity of China as the host nation which is making all of this economic exploitation possible is absolutely vital in the mind of John Hay, and so goes the second set of open door notes. And, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the implications and the ramifications of this, and principally in the writings of the very famous American diplomatic historian William Appleman Williams, who taught in his most famous book, which is called The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. Williams makes the point that if one understands the concept of the open door as being the principal driver in America's foreign policy priorities, one understands all they need to know about America's foreign policy in the world, because once you understand the what's, how's, and whys of the open door, it becomes very clear that the United States really has no alternative policy. That what we must aim for is winning general acceptance among our competitors to the principles of the open door. That whatever a nation does diplomatically ought not to affect the trading partners and where those trading partners can do business. In other words, maintaining kind of an open door principle with the existing spheres of influence. Consequently, the whole point is that anything in the world that would disrupt the potential success of the open door would be directly contrary to America's diplomatic and economic interests, and thereby political interests as well. Basically, what this open door idea did was set the United States on course to dominate the world economically, commercially, by making the world, the entire world, its potential source of markets and raw materials. But not shutting out competitors, but rather opening it up to the point that all nations would be free to trade and compete. The idea being that this kind of open success, which would not be abused by the member nations, would essentially positively affect the economic livelihoods of every one of these nations. In other words, we'd all win. This, in effect, becomes the major principle of Woodrow Wilson's post-World War I plan for peace in the world. Wilson believes when he goes to Versailles in 1918, 1919, that the future of world peace is directly contingent on the willingness of the major powers to buy into these principles and into these concepts. And so the 14-point program that Wilson brings to Versailles is a program designed to lay out the details of that overall open door idea. You know, just briefly to go back and review in a very general way Wilson's 14 points. The first one was open diplomacy, which would be, hopefully, from Wilson's point of view, an end to secret trade and secret agreements among nations. The idea that every nation would recognize and understand and know what every other nation was doing diplomatically. We would know who had treaty obligations to whom, so that another situation that, like the one that brought on World War I, which the nations realized after the fact that they were so enmeshed in these competing treaty obligations with others that as one nation after the other was pulled into what became World War I, because of treaty obligations, they were pulling in their treaty partners with them. The result was that the entire world became divided into two camps, the so-called Allied powers and the Central powers, which were the two combatants in World War I. And Wilson wants to avoid that by getting a general commitment among the major powers to practice and live by the principle of open diplomacy, open covenants openly arrived at, is the way he phrases it in the 14 points. And then the second one is access to the seas for everybody. And then the third one is open trade as part of this open sea idea, that nations are discouraged from establishing trade barriers, restrictive trade barriers. The idea being that all nations ought to have the right to be treated the way others are treated. You may have heard the principle, I hear it frequently in the media, the idea of the most favored, the idea of most favored nation, which comes directly from this. That what they later do is they add on a caveat, and the caveat is this most favored nation principle, which is that every nation is entitled to be treated by every other nation as that nation would treat its primary trade partner. In other words, the mere fact that you and I are engaged in diplomacy means that I have the right to be treated no worse than your best trading partner. And that becomes kind of an add-on to this whole idea of actually promoting free trade and promoting economic growth and promoting competition and making sure that no nation is denied access to the seas or is denied access to potential markets because of any kind of artificial tariff barriers or anything else. And then a major part of Wilson's 14-point program beyond that is the idea of disarmament. That the nations of the world are encouraged to disarm to the point that they maintain military capability to preserve domestic peace and security. In other words, they have a police power and they have the ability to put down insurrections within their own countries and things like that. But the idea of nations building up huge armies and huge navies and buying warplanes and all the rest of it, building warplanes, that kind of thing is discouraged. The assumption being that the only way that nations would feel safe and feel secure in buying into these policies if they knew and could be assured that their neighbors were doing the same thing. And finally, a major principle of the idea of Wilson's 14-point program is the principle of national self-determination. And that is the idea that every people deserves its own nation, its own flag, and deserves its own right psychologically to be able to pledge allegiance to its own nation, of its own people, its own culture, its own language, its own religious heritage, and all the rest of it. And while this is great on paper, it becomes very, very difficult to implement in a realistic way in the real world. But Wilson's idea is, and he's right, there's absolutely no question. I mean, that's the part of this that I think we all need to appreciate, is this is not just blind theory. A lot of this is based on real-world common sense. Wilson recognizes that wars usually come from national divisions within political boundaries, where you have a situation where a particular culture or a particular people is governing another people, another culture. And that obviously always leads to trouble, Wilson believes, because the minority nationality will always believe that it's being discriminated against or overtaxed or treated unfairly or whatever. Think of the Palestinian situation in the Middle East. And so Wilson's idea is that what we need to try to do is redraw the boundaries of the world in such a way that peoples are entitled to their own nation with their own governments and their own flag and their own independence and their own freedom and their own economy and all the rest of it. And if you do that, if people can pledge their loyalty to their own government and can take whatever emotional commitment they have and apply it to their own nation, their own people, then chances are that you will avoid war, especially if the other things go along with it, the disarmament and the open negotiations, open covenants and all the rest of it. Then what we would have is a world which was pretty secure, where people felt pretty safe. And of course, the key factor would be that they would know that they weren't the only ones that were doing this, but that their potential their competitors were doing it as well. And of course, and then Wilson goes through several points in which he addresses problem areas of the world, the Balkans and the Balkans and Eastern Europe and the Far East and all the rest of it, and talks about redrawing boundaries for the Russian people and redrawing boundaries for the Poles and redrawing boundaries for the nations of Eastern Europe, Serbia, and in the north and in the Baltic area, Lithuania, Latvia, and Moldavia, I believe. And anyway, this is the principle of self-determination. We've seen this past a couple of weeks in the situation in the Crimea. The Crimea, Crimea has been under the control of the government of Ukraine, which is controlled by non-Russian people. But the bulk of the population in the Crimean area is Russian. Putin has taken advantage of this by suggesting that the people of Crimea ought to have the right to reattach themselves to their homeland, so to speak. And of course, the principle sounds reasonable, except that what this essentially is secession from this is what brought on the American Civil War, is Lincoln's refusal to let the South do this. And so what Putin is doing is encouraging civil war within the Ukraine so that these people can voluntarily secede from one government and pledge allegiance to another. That's the principle that he's supporting. And that's the issue that Wilson believes ought to govern the major powers as they meet together in Versailles to try to plan for the future peace and productivity and stability of the world. That what they should do is redraw boundaries in such a way that as much as possible, opportunities of having one people govern another people are eliminated or minimized. That's the principle of self-determination. And of course, a major criticism of Wilson is that once the negotiations actually begin, he's forced to make concession after concession after concession on all of these things. There's one issue that is not part of the 14 points, but it comes later on in the 1920s as a way to implement the Treaty of Versailles. And this is tied in with the creation of the League and the establishment of what many of the textbooks refer to as the mandate system. The mandate system. And this is, I think, a very important part of this whole process. Wilson and the other major powers as well recognize that worldwide everybody is not capable of self-government. That certain portions of the world, these people believe, are not civilized enough and educated enough and sophisticated enough to be trusted to have their own independent nation. Basically, what the major powers recognize is that in order for this process to really work long term, the League is going to have to oversee a process of education whereby the less, quote, civilized, unquote, areas of the world become civilized. In other words, the major powers assume the responsibility of mentoring less developed areas of the world and bringing them, if you will, into the modern West, into the modern world, into the 20th century. What we're talking about here is a better sounding, more sophisticated idea of what in the 17th and 18th century was blatant colonialism. The difference is, and this is what the leaders at Versailles are able to do, the difference is that they recognize the colonies that belong to certain mother countries in the past. The difference would be that rather than these areas of the world being colonies of the mother country, they are renamed mandates of the League of Nations. And the country that is put in control of them has the responsibility of mentoring that area until its people are sophisticated enough and educated enough and civilized enough to be granted their own freedom as an independent nation to join the League. as an equal. Obviously, this is a dream. This is an ideal. The history of the 20th century is the story of these mandates fighting their mother countries for their own independence. The story of the 20th century in Asia, Africa, and Latin America is the story of these former colonies fighting for their own independence in order to not be economically exploited as the powers were exploiting China at the end of the 19th century. These mandates, these areas of the world that in China were called spheres of influence, are really areas of economic exploitation rather than areas of the world being mentored by the mother powers, by the mother nations, with the idea of independence in their future. This is incredibly important for a number of reasons. And so what these nations do is they sit down and they divide up the less developed areas of the world into mandates, and they assign them to the major powers. This is the way that Great Britain ended up getting control of Egypt. This is the way Great Britain ended up getting control of what becomes the Suez Canal. This is the way the major powers sit there and carve up Africa as if it was a piece of prime rib. And out of this process, in the middle of the 20th century, if you look at a map of Africa in 1950, for example, you will see that the map of Africa, look in any geography book, is color-coded. And the colors are associated with specific mother countries. For example, South Africa is pink because members of the British Empire are coded in pink on the maps of the world. So, for example, South Africa is pink. Egypt is pink. The Belgian Congo was yellow. It belonged to Belgium. An entity, a huge entity called French Equatorial Africa, was a mandate of France. In the northeast corner of a northeastern area of Africa, we have the creation of an entity called Italian Somaliland. It was assigned to Italy as a mandate. So what you have is Africa looking, being almost color-coded depending on the nation that was in control of it. The same kind of process goes on in the Far East. This is how the French got control of what becomes Vietnam. The origins of the Vietnam War, Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnam War, was the war for independence being fought by the Vietnamese people to overthrow the French. And in 1954, when the Vietnamese were successful in defeating the French in the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where France had pulled back all its forces and took one final stand in order to maintain control of what later becomes Vietnam. Once the French are defeated in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, then the United States, which is at that point engaged in what is called the Cold War, the United States is forced to make some decisions. Because Ho Chi Minh is clearly connected and affiliated with communist nations, Soviet Union, China, etc. And so the United States is able to make the point that we cannot allow the Vietnamese people to win their independence from France, because if they do, they will go communist. And if they go communist, they will become part of the Soviet Sino-Soviet bloc, the communist Chinese Soviet bloc. If that happens, then in that area of the world there's no open door for the United States. So the United States makes the determination that it must move in and replace France as the power responsible for putting down this Vietnamese version of the Boxer Rebellion. And this kind of things goes on in nation, area after area after area of the world, as one nation after the other in the mid and late 20th century is winning its independence from the French, from Belgium, from Italy, from Spain, from Portugal, and all the rest of the major powers. So what that suggests is the mandate system was all smoke. They talked about these mother countries mentoring these nations until they would become free and independent and equal partners in the League. But in reality, the mandate system became nothing but a more positive sounding system of colonialism. And these nations, these areas, these former colonies, these mandates, were left no option except to fight for their own independence. And as one nation after the other became independent in the midst of the Cold War in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, then the question was, will this newly independent country vote within the United Nations in the Soviet bloc? Will it vote with the communist nations in the Cold War, or will it vote with the West? And so consequently, the United States finds itself in the position of intervening and influencing the internal affairs of these areas of the world in order to affect the outcome. I can remember, for example, and I may have mentioned this before, but in a different context, the situation of the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1971, 72, and I can't remember the exact dates of the event. But the fact of the matter was that Allende was a socialist. He was a communist. He was threatening to nationalize industry in Chile, specifically the copper industry, which would mean that Western corporations would be ousted from Chile. So corporate interests, many of them American, had a vested interest in not allowing the Allende regime to succeed. The people of Chile, democratically, had voted a socialist into office. And because he was a socialist, and because he was threatening to nationalize industries and throw out the exploiters, the United States directly engaged in the kind of surreptitious policies and programs designed to stimulate discord and unrest in Chile, which ultimately ended up in the overthrow and murder of Salvador Allende. There's absolutely no question that the records are clear that we did that. The United States did that. You may remember the same thing was happening during the Reagan administration in Latin America as well. The situation that surfaced in the scandal called Iran-Contra, where the United States was channeling money that Iran was buying weapons and paying the money, and that ultimately the Oliver Norths of the world were taking the money and using it to feed rebellion in Latin America in order to topple socialist pro-left governments. And we have words in our vocabulary like the Sandinistas. And so this kind of behavior in Latin America and Asia and all the rest of it stems from the program and the plans laid out at the end of World War I at the peace conference at the end of Versailles. And the mandate system is a critical part of it, because as the world in the 60s and 70s and 80s Western world becomes more and more dependent on oil, then this oil-rich area of the world called the Middle East is obviously divided up at Versailles in such a way that the Middle East itself will be divided into mandates. And just as the Boxers tried to link and overthrow all the Westerners out of China, and just as Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, so-called, tried to oust Western nations, first the French and then the United States, from Vietnam, so also did the Middle Eastern oil powers commit to themselves to unite and to organize their control of oil and Western dependency on that oil. And we have the creation of OPEC, which is the Middle Eastern form of rebellion against Western exploitation of their natural resources of the region. So all of this is particularly important. But again, going back to the plan, when Wilson called World War I the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy, what he was basically talking about was a plan for the world. If you think about and reflect on the plan itself, the purpose of it was designed to carve up the world and assign it in pieces to the major powers, so that all the major powers would have their own spheres of influence. The major powers would have their own potential consumer markets. The major powers would have their own potential sources of raw materials. In other words, the major powers could compete peacefully for economic success and sales, commercial success. And the bulk of the world, the non-white world, was relegated into second-class citizenship by being carved up and assigned as mandates to the major powers, which is effectively areas to be exploited. Wilson believed that if you did this, and if these nations really did mentor these third world areas of the world into the principles of free enterprise and political democracy, as it were, that eventually these nations could become freestanding, independent nations and members of the League, and later on the United Nations. So all of this is part of a very, very intricate plan. And the fact that the United States has found itself in the 20th century intervening in some of these areas of the world that people who are educated in this country can't even spell, had never heard of before. The reason for it is this, is the idea of open door. That once the world after World War II is divided between the communist world and the free world, so to speak, then which direction a potentially independent nation is leaning toward becomes a factor in America's foreign policy decisions based on the concept of the open door. And that's what William Appleman Williams meant when he wrote in his Tragedy of American Diplomacy, that you could almost predict exactly how the United States is going to behave diplomatically and politically, depending on what the potential focus, the potential result of political independence for these so-called third world areas. We had the Western world being the first world, and the Soviet world being the second world, and the third world was the underdeveloped world. That was the prize that everybody was after. They were, after World War I, they were the mandates, so to speak. And so that becomes the basis of the post-war world. This is what would make the world safe for democracy, according to President Wilson. Would make World War I the war to end all wars. Because if you think about it, if it had indeed worked, it would have been the war to end all wars. Because in the treaty as finally written, Article 10, which becomes the key article within the United States, causes the United States to refuse to join the League of Nations. Article 10 mandates members of the League to support the League in putting down aggression throughout the world. In other words, the League is the enforcer for all of this. And so the League is the agent of all the major powers. It's the only one, theoretically, that has arms. It's the only one that can militarily act worldwide, because the nations have agreed to disarm. So the idea is, if any nation seems to be potentially disrupting the plan, then all the other nations would come together and create an international force to put down that threat. It would be the enforcer. And Henry Cabot Lodge and some leading conservative members of the Senate of the United States commit themselves to defeating American membership in the League. And one of the major arguments is that Article 10 of the League violates the Constitution of the United States, which gives the power to declare war to the Congress of the United States. Article 10 gives that power to the League. And so obviously, if military decisions for the United States are going to be made in Europe at Geneva, then the United States is effectively surrendering a portion of its independence by joining the League. That's really what we're talking about here. When nations join the League, they give up their right to act totally independently of everybody else. And they commit a portion, they sacrifice a portion of their independence to the benefit of the whole, to the community of nations. Wilson's plan is a plan, literally, I mean, I look at it from a historical point of view. Wilson's plan, diplomatically, is a plan to stop time. It is a plan to stop future growth and development where it is, divide up the world as the way the world looks then at Versailles, take a snapshot of the world at that time. Those are the major powers. They're the ones that get the mandates. Look at the areas of the world that will become the mandate areas. They're assigned to certain major powers to be mentored and gradually brought into the world of nations, the community of nations. But until they are ready, until they are civilized enough and sophisticated enough, they need to remain mandates. What you're asking these major nations to do is to voluntarily surrender areas that economically they are exploiting, and they won't do it. So the only way that these mandates ever get their independence is to fight for it. Most of the foreign policy decisions of the 20th century are made in response to decisions made at Versailles. It is an absolutely incredibly important event in the history of the modern world. And while Wilson is called an idealist and everything else, the fact of the matter is, whether Democrat or Republican from that time on, no administration, no political party in the United States has done anything to rescind the concepts and the principles which underlay the peace conference at Versailles. The open door still operates. It is still a priority of American foreign policy. All the debates that we're hearing now in the media, watching talk shows, it doesn't matter whether they're on Fox or whether they're on MSNBC. The focus of conversation right now is on the Crimean situation. People's attention is focused on trying to figure out the psychology and the psyche of one Vladimir Putin. Is Putin trying to recreate the Soviet Union, the fallen Soviet Union? Is Putin in the business of reestablishing the Cold War? Is the Crimea step in a series of steps? Does the Crimean situation ought to put Latvia and Lithuania on notice? Ought it to put the Czech Republic and Slovakia, the nation of Slovakia, on notice? All of these nations, Czechoslovakia was divided along the principles of self-determination defined by Wilson at Versailles into the Czech nation and into the independent nation of Slovakia. We saw them recently in the Winter Olympics in terms of their hockey teams. And so the question is Putin about restoring Hungary as a satellite to Slovakia, as a satellite to Russia, and eliminating all of these independent nations like Latvia and Lithuania and Uzbekia and all of these other, Moldavia and all of these that were created around the principle of self-determination. And so policymakers in Washington are basically wrestling with what steps the United States ought to take to deal with this reality, to deal with Putin, because the fact of the matter is, if Putin does this, then the commercial and economic access that we have enjoyed since the fall of the Soviet Union would be endangered. And that's really what all of this is about. Again, it is a very, very important concept. We have just about reached the top of the hour, the end of our first hour. When we come back, I'm going to ask all of us to spend a moment reflecting a little bit conceptually in looking at the international structure created at Versailles in 1919, 1920, 1921. And then comparing it with what was going on domestically in the United States at that time, which we have defined as labeled the progressive movement. I would suggest to you that the similarities in structure and operation between the plan that Wilson brought to Versailles and the reform program that Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson brought to the nation in terms of progressivism are very, very similar. And each one helps us understand the other because they operate pretty much the same, they function from the same premises. I think there's something to be said for this. But first, let's pause and take a brief break, 5-minute break. It's 5 p.m. in the East, it's top of the hour. I want to thank you for being with us here at the Virtual Center. I want to encourage you to stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. I am Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to the program. If you are just joining us, welcome. If you've been with us through our first hour, then I really want to thank you for staying with us. For those of you who just joined us, our first hour was kind of a review of the open door policy and Wilson's 14-point program and the implications for the 20th century world that are indicated in that structure. And we talked a little bit about it. And as I mentioned, this second hour, I want to get back to it and make some connections, hopefully, that will allow us to get our arms around the whole issue of political reform itself. Because I think one thing we're beginning to see is that we're looking at people who tend to confront, who define problems the same way and conceive solutions to those problems from the same arsenal of options. And so what I'm saying, and over the years I've begun to recognize this for students. If students can begin to see some of these patterns and they begin to see that certain situations produce the same responses over and over again, then becomes much easier to understand and wrap your arms around and draw inferences from it and really understand. And that's what I think we're dealing with here. So, and again, let me remind you that our phones are down. We can't take phone calls because we had a power surge that apparently messed up the telephone interface for the Head-On Radio Network. So we're looking at a one-way system pretty much. But I would love to hear from you if you have comments or suggestions, and I'll be glad to bring those ideas that you send me via email to the air here on tomorrow's program. If you have ideas or comments that you would like to make, by all means, send them to me in an email, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. We were I was mentioning the issue of conceptually. I would like to deal with this a little bit, and one of the things we've been talking about is structure, and I want to just briefly just outline very quickly the structure of the League of Nations. We didn't get into that at all. We got into what it was supposed to do and how it was supposed to work, but this is the way it was set up. And I'm anxious to see if you recognize the pattern of this. Every member nation, every independent nation that is a member of the League is a member of the Assembly of the League. The Big Five nations, the major nations, if you will, at this time, Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. Those are the Big Five at the end of World War I. Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. And 4 other nations that will be members of the Big Nine, so to speak, on a rotating basis. They make up what we would call the Executive Council of the League as opposed to the Assembly. The Assembly is comprised of all the nations. The Executive Council is composed only of the Big Five plus 4 others which change periodically. The administrative staff of the League, the people that actually do the day-to-day work of the League, are located in Geneva, Switzerland. They man the headquarters for the League of Nations. That would be what technically is called the Secretariat of the League. And then developed very early in the 1920s is the Permanent Court of International Justice, the so-called World Court. That handles diplomatic disputes among nations. Issues or disputes that have international connotations. They resolve disputes. So again, what you have is an assembly in which sit all the member nations. You have an executive council of the Big Five: Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. That's the executive council. Then you have the World Court, which is the judicial idea of international governance. And then you have the Secretariat, the permanent administrative structure of the League, located in Geneva. Do you see the similarities in structure between that and the structure of the United States government under the Constitution of the United States? Congress, the legislative branch. In the League is the Assembly. The executive branch, which in the Constitution of the United States is the President. The executive branch is comprised of the 5 major nations plus 4 alternates. The judicial branch, which is comprised of the Supreme Court and so many inferior courts as Congress shall determine, is the judicial branch of the American political structure. The World Court is its equivalent in the League of Nations. And you have the permanent administrative structure, the bureaucracy, if you will, which manages the day-to-day operations of the League. In other words, the organizational structure of world government is a mirror of the organizational structure of the government of the United States, which in turn is a replica of the Republican form of government established in Great Britain, with Parliament and the King. Basically, what we are suggesting here, what the League suggests, is that the nations of the world should buy into the model as being the most efficient and the most effective for effective government adopted by the democracies. You will notice that not mentioned among the Big Five is Russia. You may recall that in World War I at the beginning, Russia was one of the major allies. Russia was one of the key allies in an effort to defeat Germany, because Russia dominated the so-called Eastern Front. For those of you who grew up watching Hogan's Heroes, you may remember that the ongoing fear of Colonel Klink was the fear that his superiors would send him to the Eastern Front, which was the Russian front. And nobody in the German army wanted that. But as you know, at the height of the war, in 1917, the Tsar is overthrown, and the interim Republican government set up under Alexander Kerensky is toppled as well by the Bolsheviks, the communists, Lenin. And as I'm sure you remember, no sooner does Russia experience the Bolshevik Revolution than the new communist government of Russia engages in a separate treaty with Germany, the so-called Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and pulls Germany out of the war by making a separate peace. Pulls Russia out of the war by making a separate peace with Germany. What that does is allow the Germans to amass all their forces in the West. As long as Germany was forced to fight a two-front war, with Russia being one of the allies, the potential strength of the German military was mitigated. But once Russia signs a separate peace, and then Germany can focus all of its strength on the war in the West. And so what you have is a very unique situation. Because this war to make the world safe for democracy was originally a contradiction in terms, because one of the major partners in the Allied war effort was Russia under the Tsar. There's absolutely no question that the overthrow of the Tsar was in part an effort to set up a democratic-like government in Russia so that Russia would become a logical partner with the other democracies in their fight against the Central Powers. But once Lenin and the communists are successful, they overthrow the interim government and pull Russia out of the war. Not only that, but Russia makes known to the world all the secret treaties and secret agreements that the Allies have made during the process of the war. In other words, Russia becomes the Edward Snowden, if you will, becomes NASA's Edward Snowden by publicizing and releasing to the world all the secret deals that Great Britain and France and the rest of them were talking about making when the war over. When Germany's defeated, you'll control this, we'll control that. In other words, they're scoping out the ideas of the mandate system while the war's going on, and saying, when this is over, you get this, and I'll take that, and all of this. And Russia, because it was one of the allies, was a party to all of this. But when Russia withdraws from the war and makes known all the secret deals and secret treaties amongst the allies, it really punctures the democracy balloon, the freedom balloon of the allies. It makes much of the Allied war effort look rather hypocritical to the world. And so consequently, there's every effort in the world on the part of the West to do everything they can do to topple the communists in Russia. to the point that the United States itself contributes troops to a military force in the northern Pacific, in the Arctic, that moves in the hopes that the communist government which came to power in Russia would fall. The reason I'm saying all of this is because there is history, there is reason behind the Russian distrust of the West and distrust of the United States, which ultimately emerges in World War II and the Cold War. The United States militarily participated in an effort to topple the communist government of the Bolsheviks before it became too secure in power in 1918. Wilson did this. And so obviously the Bolsheviks, the communists, are not invited to sit at the victor's table at Versailles. Not only is Germany not there, but neither is Russia. And the fact of the matter is, the entire idealistic plan developed at Versailles doesn't have much of a chance of working when two of the major powers in the world are not there. But there's absolutely no question that Russian distrust of the West and of the United States in particular goes all the way back to World War I. And when Stalin comes into power in Russia, he is very aware of this history. And he's very aware of manipulating the international situation to his own advantage. And again, Americans have this incredible ability to forget history when it's convenient. And a lot of this stuff, I think, is interesting. I was looking at an article. I plan to bring it to the program, whether we'll get a chance this week or not. But there was an article during this whole debate about the Crimea situation about Vladimir Putin. And the question was, is Putin the bully or is the United States the bully? And the whole gist of this article is that, if you remember, Crimea was originally part of Russia. It's populated, for one, is yet another example of why Russia would feel this idea of seeking revenge and restitution for having been mistreated. In other words, Russia's position is that whenever it's been weak, it's been taken advantage of by the West. And so all of this history, it seems to me, is important. But anyway, what I wanted to emphasize during this, our second hour today, was the extent to which the international structure created at Versailles for the world, for world government, is modeled almost directly on the political structure developed in Philadelphia in 1787 by the founders. The division of the administrative structure of the League into three functions: an executive function, a legislative function, and a judicial function. Basically, what I'm suggesting here is that if you look at problems and you look at the way we tend to define problems, we tend to define solutions to those problems by going to the well and coming up with the same options for solving them. You gotta have an organization where everybody belongs. You gotta, in order for decisions to be accepted and followed, decisions to be agreed to, in order to get buy-in from the member nations in the League, you got to give them a voice. You got to let them participate. So you got to have a legislative branch. You got to have an assembly to which everybody belongs. And of course, the whole idea is the so-called third world, the less developed parts of the world, by being assigned as mandates, they are supposedly undergoing an educational process which is going to give them the credibility and the capability of becoming independent nations and ultimately free and independent members of the League. Have a seat as an equal partner in the assembly. But the major decisions are going to be made by the Executive Council, the big countries, the big guys. The United States, Japan, Great Britain, France, and Italy. Doesn't include Russia, doesn't include Germany. I think that condemns the potential success of the whole thing from the very beginning. At the end of World War II, Roosevelt and Churchill recognized very clearly, when the United Nations is on the table, that Russian communism, Soviet Union or not, we got to have Stalin. Many of the compromises made to Stalin during and after World War II were compromises made with the idea that we've got to keep Russia on board. We've got to include the Soviet Union in the post-war plan, otherwise it can't work. We learned that from World War I. And so much of the history, the modern history, has been focused on that picture from Yalta, which shows that very famous photo of Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin. And Stalin looked so robust and FDR looked so weak. And many people have used that as an example of why we gave away so much to Stalin. What we effectively gave Eastern Europe to Stalin. Why do we do that? And the argument, of course, was that if we knew that the United Nations was potentially the solution to the problems of the world, and the only way it could work was if Soviet Union belonged. We had to keep Stalin on board. Fact of the matter is, Stalin knew that. And Stalin brought with him all the resentments that came out of World War I and the way that the West treated the Bolsheviks and treated Lenin when they came to power in 1917. They didn't forget. I think we've paid the price for a lot of this in terms of our history. But there's a third piece that I wanted to go back to, and this is the movement. We spend a lot of time here at the Virtual Center talking about the progressive movement, the reform movement that occurs in the late 19th and early 20th century to address the domestic problems created by industrialism within the United States. We talked about the reform movement beginning in the cities, because the cities obviously become the focus of attention during looking at the worst aspects of industrialism, because the cities and the governments and the infrastructure of those cities is incapable of dealing with the flood of people that the Industrial Revolution brings to America's cities in search of jobs. Millions of immigrants coming into the country from principally Europe. Tens of thousands of rural people moving from the farms to the cities in pursuit of jobs. Many African Americans from the South coming into the North, leaving Virginia and the Carolinas and Alabama and Mississippi and all the rest of it, and coming to jobs in Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and all of those places in the North. The result is that America's cities explode, and they end up with political structures which are in many cases inadequate and incapable of addressing the problems of disease and overcrowding and inadequate housing and inadequate transportation and sanitation and the unsafe working conditions in the factories that are emerging during the period, and the explosion in the degrees of crime that occur in the cities, and the hostilities between different nationalities crowded into America's city, all of these things. So there's obvious reason for the conclusion that the reform movement, which we know as progressivism, began in America's cities. But it became very quickly that municipal government, by its very definition, was incapable of addressing all of the problems associated with industrialism in America. So increasingly the progressive movement moved to the state level, and we had many progressive governors that became reform leaders. The one I have in mind right now is Robert La Follette in Wisconsin. And the states become laboratories for many of the new experiments in creating regulatory structures to try to reform and address some of the major problems being created by industrialism. And then eventually the reform movement moves from the state level to the national level in the persons of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and the very famous and important election, so-called progressive election of 1912, where you had three candidates. You had the third-party candidate, Theodore Roosevelt. He was the Bull Moose candidate. He was the progressive candidate. You had Wilson for the Democrats, and then, of course, you had William Howard Taft, who was the mainstream Republican candidate. And, of course, the key thing is that Taft finishes a very distant third behind Wilson and Roosevelt. Wilson's elected in 1912. Roosevelt, the third-party candidate, probably has the best chance of a third-party victory in America's two-party system ever. But the combination of the vote that Wilson gets plus the combination that Roosevelt got, when weighed against the rather paltry turnout that Taft gets as a mainstream Republican, is an indication that public opinion in America has clearly changed from the late 19th century, from the laissez-faire, Darwin-inspired philosophy of late 19th century America, and has moved. The mentality of America has become, for all practical purposes, progressive. Whether it's in the cities, whether it's at the state level or the national level, there seems to be a general acceptance of the key principles of progressivism, that we can no longer afford to support the idea of unregulated free enterprise because it's creating more problems than it's solving. We must find ways to get a hold of and manage our societies. We begin to have reform ideologies coming to the fore. People like Lester Ward, the sociologist Lester Ward, who take on Darwin and point out that even in Darwin, the competition and struggle for existence that so many corporations use to justify unregulated free operations for corporations. Even Darwin recognized that some management, some cooperation within nature happened. And the idea that government needed to be brought in and given the capability of managing and regulating and controlling and addressing some of these problems. So beginning in the cities and then moving to the states and then moving to the nation, we begin to have these creation of political structures and organizations and committees and agencies. And so in our cities, for example, we have transportation committees, and we have housing committees, and we have school committees, and we have health and sanitation committees that manage and oversee the infrastructure and the infrastructure improvements to make America's cities more able to accommodate the changes of an industrial, modern 20th century world. And on the state level, many state governments begin to adopt regulatory agencies to regulate trade and commerce and business and the availability of capital and the availability of money to loan, the banks loan starting businesses and all the rest of it. And we have government that feels that it has the right to move in and protect the working conditions and living conditions of its citizens. And that's what, of course, gives rise to the very famous Lochner case in New York, where the state of New York took it upon itself to limit the hours of work in bakeries. And the Supreme Court, the holdout, if you will, the sole holdout within government of the old laissez-faire idea of corporate, of unregulated free enterprise, strikes down Lochner. And we have the very positive and effective dissenting opinions of Oliver Wendell Holmes. And I'm stuck for the other dissent that we looked at. And so increasingly the idea of government as an active player, as an active manager, as regulator, as overseer. And then, of course, we looked at this document because we actually went through it chapter, paragraph by paragraph here at the Virtual Center, which is the speech delivered in 1910 in Kansas by Theodore Roosevelt on progressivism, his so-called New Nationalist speech, in which Roosevelt talks about his commitment to the idea of the square deal and the idea that no longer can we afford to allow corporations to operate independently and unhindered. We have got to get control of the major corporations. We have got to restore justice and hope into our cities and into our states and into our government at all levels in order for the American system of government to work. He admits in his New Nationalism speech that you can't avoid corporations. You can't eliminate them. That's naive. But you can regulate them, and you can make sure that in the name of the public interest, you make sure that corporations do what they should do. And government's number one priority is to support the concept of the public interest, to support the community at large, to support everybody. And Roosevelt makes the point in his Square Deal that while the focus of our attention is on corporations, it is important to recognize that corporations have rights too. And as much as I think that they are a major problem in America, Roosevelt says, I will go to the mat to defend their right to have rights and to be heard as well. And what he defines is a role for government almost as the honest broker. The idea that instead of having groups pitted against other groups, trying to prevail and get their own self-interest over somebody else, what Roosevelt is trying to do is establish a concept where these competing groups would come to government and look upon government as just and fair, as what we call the honest broker, who would make the best, most honest decisions in the interests of the community at large, the interests of society at large, and make decisions accordingly. So from this, government begins to create agencies, regulatory agencies, like the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate commerce, interstate trade, and housing commissions, and a labor commission to represent, the Department of Labor to represent the best interests of working people. And Wilson creates the Federal Reserve System in order to regulate and get control of the banking system in America. And the whole idea of this piece of legislation and this agency and that agency is based on the principle that government needs to employ the kinds of people who have the wisdom and the intelligence to effectively regulate these organizations, not eliminate them, because we need them. Their existence is in the public interest. But in order to make sure that the public interest is always served, we need to control what they do. We need to manage and regulate what they do and make sure that everything is pointed in the direction of what's in the best interest of the American public, of the American community at large. And Roosevelt makes the argument that his principal goal is to make sure that everybody is treated fairly, not equally, but fairly. In other words, our equality of outcome is not our goal. He says that. He quotes Lincoln at the beginning of his speech to defend the idea of equality of opportunity and inequality, provided it's the kind of inequality that serves the public interest because it gives people the incentive to try and work hard and all the rest of it. So the goal is not equality of outcome. The goal is equality of opportunity, a fair shot for everybody. And the idea is that government must win that trust so that labor trusts us, corporations trust us, farmers trust us. Everybody trusts government to make the best decisions in the interests of the nation at large. And that kind of security and that kind of stability and that kind of management expertise is what's needed to address and solve many of the problems that are so desperate to be solved, problems which were created by the incredible onset of industrialism. I would ask that you look at the similarity between the way Roosevelt defines the nation's problems and the way that Wilson defined the world problems at Versailles in his 14 points. There's absolutely no question that Wilson's 14-point program is the international version of progressivism. Managing the behavior of corporations, managing the behavior of nations, making sure that no nation is so well armed that it threatens the stability and the security of others. Government agencies making sure that no corporation becomes so overpowering or so powerful that it threatens the financial success of other businesses, competing businesses. The idea that that the way free enterprise works is through competition. There must be competition. You can't allow anybody to become so powerful that they wipe out all their competitors, because then the laws of supply and demand and prices don't happen. The only way that we can trust that we'll get the best price and the best product for the best price is through a system of competition, of free and fair competition. And the only way to guarantee that, since everybody in the game would like to eliminate all their competitors, the only way to do that is to trust somebody to manage the game, to umpire the game in such a way that everybody has an equal shot. And that somebody is government. And so only government will have the power to maintain that structure. So in effect, progressivism talks about disarming corporations and, beyond a certain point, to disarm unions as well. Labor has the right to organize. Labor has the right to come to us and make its case, and we'll decide what the best interests of the nation require and call for in a particular situation or under a particular set of circumstances. So again, progressivism tends to define domestic problems and to address solutions to those problems in the very same way that Wilson goes to Versailles and wants the League of Nations to oversee and manage international problems. And the goal, whether it's international or whether it's domestic, the goal is trade, commerce, business. It's the functioning of capitalism. But what progressivism brings is the change, the idea that competition cannot be unregulated. It must be managed. It must be regulated. It must be planned. The world, in order to avoid wars, Wilson is saying, can no longer afford to have nations armed to the teeth making secret agreements with each other, making agreements to isolate the third party, bring down their governments, and destroy their ability to do business with inordinately high tariffs, which deny them access to raw materials they need, to timber or oil or steel or whatever it is that they might need that they don't have enough of. Somebody needs to manage it in such a way, because nations are not willingly going to go under for lack of raw materials. If they find out that there's something they need that they don't have, they're going to get it. Either they'll get it peacefully or they'll get it not peacefully. The purpose of the League is to hear their problems, and the purpose of the court is to make a determination as to what this nation needs in order to remain viable. Why does it need to remain viable? Because it is what we have to have in order to maintain the stability and security of the domestic society that government governs. We need that government in place to govern its people. If it looks like people are going to try to topple that government, we need to do something about it. And that's the plan. It's the application of science as it existed at that time to the industrial and diplomatic and social and political problems of the world. Management is increasingly becoming a science. I'm thinking of the management system created during this period by the very famous Frederick Winslow Taylor and his idea of Taylorism, the idea of efficiency. Did you ever, have you ever worked in a place, in an industrial environment, where the company, the corporation, brings in management experts, people to study the jobs, study what you do and how you do it on a regular basis in order to make proposals for reform. Find ways to make your job more efficient. Find ways to allow you to do your job better in a way which is going to generate more revenue for the company. Find ways to make the whole productive operation more efficient by relocating certain employees from one area to the other and all the rest of it. The idea is that managing an enterprise, an organization, is scientific. It's a science. We need professionally trained people to do it. That's what the universities are about. The major universities that are created at this time, what they do is they provide the efficiency expert, the management expert, the economist, the sociologist, the psychologist, the political scientists, and the historians. They provide all of these trained experts to bring their expertise to the table so that some of the major political, social, economic, and political problems which confront the modern industrial nation are resolved. That's the same model that Wilson wants to bring to the world. And the peace treaty at the end of World War I is an effort to get the major nations of the world to buy into that framework. It is absolutely brilliant if you think about it. It's clearly idealistic in a lot of ways. But it's realistic in many ways as well. I would suggest to you that the way organizations have operated and functioned from then, I don't care, call it the Boy Scouts, call it the Girl Scouts, call it unions, call it whatever. We conduct our meetings. Robert's Rules of Order, which are the way that we set up our structures and conduct our meetings, are modeled on the same principles. The founders at Philadelphia in 1787. How do you manage a nation? How do you manage 13 independent states and bring them together in a way which benefits everybody to be a member of this union? A government that has the power to put down domestic insurgency, put down insurrections, put down Shays' Rebellion, and all of that. Madison's whole criticism of the Articles of Confederation was based on the idea that each of the states was too independent. There was no way to get the states to work together in the common interests of everybody as long as they were that independent. And so what you had to do is find a way to get the leaders of these states to be willing to give up a portion of their independence to the national interest as defined in Washington. And the federal government would play the political role within the United States that the League of Nations will play in the 20th century world of nations. The states, the independent nations that belong to the League, maintain their independence and their freedom. The states which belong to the Union within the domestic United States maintain their freedom and independence. There needs to be a joint sharing of problems and powers between the states and the federal government, but those are constantly going to come into dispute. So we need a federal court system to resolve disputes between the federal government and the states which make up the Union, just as we need the World Court to solve problems that come up between independent nations that belong to the League and the Executive Council of the League. The model is incredible. The way problems are defined is the same. The recommended way to address those problems and solve them in ways that will satisfy everybody are the outcome. You got to have everybody with a voice. You got to let everybody participate. If you want everybody to accept the decision, you've got to give everybody a sense that they participated and had the right to be heard in making that decision. That's the assembly in the League. That's the Congress of the United States in terms of representing the voice of constituents, representing those constituents that elect them as their representatives. It has bothered me for many years why we can't seem to make this kind of analysis available to our youngsters in classes. It seems to me that the system is so common sense, so logical, it makes such perfect sense. Why should we be requiring students to take courses in how their government works and failing that course? Businesses are organized and function the same way as government does. International businesses with branch offices, not only throughout the country but throughout the world, manage the same system and manage their businesses and operations in the same way. How much autonomy do you give the branches overseas? How many decisions do you insist be made at home by the mother country, or by the major headquarters of the corporation? How much autonomy do you allow the members of the organization to have? And all of these management structures, administrative structures, become part of academic disciplines in our colleges and universities, where a branch of political science, for example, becomes administrative science. Administrative management becomes a focus. Urban management, urban planning and management. People get degrees in planning and management. All of them based on the same kinds of models. And it seems to me that if our students were able to get their arms around these models, they could begin to understand that there's similarity in the way people define problems and define solutions to those problems. It took a while, but that's kind of where I hoped that we would get here at the Virtual Center, by going back and looking at the foreign policy issues that governed and drove decision-making in the 20th century. I invite you to be with us tomorrow for another version of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We'll be on a new topic tomorrow. I hope you can join us. Have a wonderful evening. Please stay tuned for Bob Kincaid and his program on the Head On Radio Network. We are 2 minutes from the top of the hour. I want to thank you so much for your willingness to give us your valuable time. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, and be safe.